up on this Friday edition of Newsline at noon, a South Korean civic group sends anti-Pyongyang leaflets to the north despite North Korea's warnings. Such a move will spell a catastrophe in inter-Korean relations. Korea's central bank chief, brushing aside calls for expansionary monetary policies, urges the government to focus more on deregulation and structural reforms. Plus, the World Bank chief calls for rapid and decisive measures to contain the Ebola outbreak, which top U.S. medical officials liken to the emergence of AIDS. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's new Friday, October 10th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome. Our top story this lunchtime: North Korea's demand to block the cross-border spread of anti-Pyongyang leaflets was not enough to stop a South Korean activist group from pushing ahead with its plan of doing exactly that earlier today.
Watchers say North Korea's threat to retaliate if they do so is aimed at turning the screw on the South Korean government to position itself well ahead of upcoming high-level inter-Korean talks. Kim Jongun has more.
A South Korean activist group went ahead with its plan to fly anti-Pyongyang leaflets across the border on Friday, despite warnings from the north that they would retaliate as the day marks the founding anniversary of the North's ruling Workers' Party. North Korea's agency in charge of inter-Korean relations says that if Seoul does not stop the fighters of Free North Korea from going ahead with their plans, relations between the two Koreas could crumble.
If the South Korean authorities allow the leaflet scattering operation, North-South relations will again be pushed to an uncontrollable catastrophe, and Seoul will have to bear the responsibility.
Tensions have been raised since an exchange of fire earlier this week after a North Korean naval vessel violated the western maritime border. Seoul sees the move as a way for Pyongyang to position itself favorably ahead of planned high-level talks between the two Koreas. Seoul's Unification Ministry has asked the civic activists to think carefully and scrap their plan to give them the best possible chance to improve inter-Korean ties at a critical time. Kim Jongun, Arirang News.
And as Myung-gil told us in his report, North Korea is celebrating the 69th anniversary of the founding of the ruling Workers' Party on this Friday, and all eyes are on whether leader Kim Jong-un will show up for the festivities. The young leader hasn't been seen in public for over a month, fueling rumors about his ill health. Kim Jongun, the director of the party's United Front Department, told South Korean officials last Saturday that the young leader has no health problems. The party's anniversary is one of the most important events in North Korea, and Kim attended the ceremony last year. The U.S. ambassador to South Korea says Washington is planning to test new forms of dialogue with North Korea. In a recent interview with the daily Joseonilbo, Sung Kim said the existing six-party framework is still valid, but the U.S. is willing to get more creative and hold bilateral, trilateral, or four-way talks to tackle North Korea's nuclear ambitions. The six-party talks involving the two Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, and aimed at denuclearizing Pyongyang, have been stalled since 2008. Kim will end his term as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea on October 24th and is expected to serve as the special representative for North Korea policy. Now, a former senior U.S. diplomat says a policy rethink for Washington isn't likely despite North Korea's recent diplomatic strides to re-engage with the international community. Our Hwang Sang-hee had a chance to sit down with James Kelly, former U.S. Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the George W. Bush administration, who says that's why North Korea is turning to South Korea.
It's interesting that with all the divisions in the American Congress, for example, they are unanimous on not wanting to give any money to North Korea. And as we've seen historically, when North Korea can't get anybody else to give them good things, they turn to their South Korean brothers. And this is good news, because any resolution of this issue is going to be done by Koreans on the Korean Peninsula, and not by Americans and not by Chinese.
Now that China is sort of taking a bigger role in the international sanctions against the North, and it's also becoming pretty close with South Korea, do you think that Pyongyang would want to come back to the six-party talks, knowing that it might be outnumbered?
North Korea has never wanted the six-party talks. Certainly at the early stages, it was much more of a 5+1. And when you really get into the issues, all five parties, not including North Korea, all five parties want a denuclearization of weapons on the Korean Peninsula. But I would say that the six-party talks was really the first time that South Korea had a prominent and equal position to everyone else.
Based on your experience as a chief U.S. envoy to North Korea, you've led numerous nuclear talks. Do you think it's ever possible for North Korea to fully give up its nuclear program, or have we come too far to hope for that?
It's possible, but it's not very likely. The nuclear program has benefits that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons or military deterrence or anything else. It is a vehicle that gets North Korea, that would otherwise be one of the more impoverished countries of the whole world, attention on the international stage that it couldn't get any other way. But I see the nuclear weapons question and the whole question of North Korea's isolation and its economic self-isolation from the rest of the world as very closely related problems. And so when you take care of one set of these problems, the others are going to become easier. If North Korea becomes seriously involved in world trade and interactions with other countries, it's going to be less interested in boasting about nuclear weapons that it may or may not have.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, that was our Hwang Sang-yi speaking with James Kelly, a former US official on matters related to the Korean Peninsula. Now, the Japanese government has slammed Korean prosecutors' decision to indict a Japanese reporter on charges of defaming President Park Geun-hye. Speaking at a press conference on Thursday, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said freedom of the press should be respected and that the indictment was far out of the norms of the accepted wisdom in the international community. He also said that the move would damage the two countries' ties. Tatsuya Kato, the head of the Seoul bureau of Japan's Sankei Shimbun newspaper, was indicted on Wednesday on charges of making false claims in August about the president's whereabouts and activities on April 16th. The day of the Seoul-ho ferry disaster. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan and Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol appear to have different ideas about the right path of recovery for the Korean economy. Both are attending a meeting of officials hosted by the IMF and the World Bank in Washington this week. Our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
There's mounting pressure on the Bank of Korea to lower the country's main benchmark interest rate from the current 2.25%. It is expected to make a decision on the rate next Wednesday. The government, which is planning to inject an additional $4.7 billion into the economy on top of other stimulus programs this year, has called for stimulus monetary measures as well. But the central bank chief has a different recipe for the economy. Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol said Thursday in Washington Washington that there was little to nothing that a rate cut could do on its own to induce growth, suggesting that other measures will be needed. A rate cut could actually increase the country's debt in the long term, ultimately constraining domestic demand, since the policy would induce households and businesses to spend more despite their growing debt. Instead, Governor Lee highlighted a need for structural changes to induce growth that would bridge the gap between the manufacturing and service sectors and between large conglomerates and small and mid-sized companies. Meanwhile, there are differences of opinion on how the Korean economy is doing. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-won says the economy will grow in the upper 3% range this year, while the BOK scaled back its previous projection to the mid 3% range. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News.
Now, Korea's shipbuilders lost ground to their competitors in Japan last month due to their rivals' increasing price competitiveness thanks to the weakening Japanese yen. London-based Clarkson Research Service says Japan's shipbuilding orders in September logged more than 550,000 compensated gross tons. That's about 27% of the global total. Korean shipbuilders obtained new orders totaling around 420,000 CGTs last month. Japan's monthly ship orders have surpassed Korea's twice this year, once in April and once in June. As well as the weakening yen, analysts say there's been a trend towards increased sales of oil tankers, which is a traditional stronghold of Japanese shipbuilders.
Let's now get a check on the international headlines for following this hour. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the News Center.
Eunice, leaders at international organizations are collectively raising their voice now. It's time to act quickly to combat Ebola in West Africa, they say, as the Ebola scare is spreading like wildfire throughout the world.
Right, Mark. We learned earlier today that an Australian Red Cross nurse who had served in Sierra Leone tested negative to Ebola. She was admitted to a Queensland hospital yesterday after showing flu symptoms. Nonetheless, authorities and healthcare professionals around the globe remain vigilant, as you say, as leaders continue to call for a swift mobilization of resources to the source. At a conference in Washington, UN Chief Ban Ki-moon said the world needs a 20-fold resource mobilization to deal with the outbreak in West Africa, while World Bank President Kim Jongun warned of catastrophic economic costs to the continent of Africa if we fail to act now. U.S. authorities announced they would add an extra layer of screening for Ebola at its 5 busiest international airports beginning Saturday local time, as UK officials said they would also screen travelers from Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea at Heathrow and Gatwick airports, as well as Eurostar railway terminals. And they're off even before they began. Formal dialogue that was to kick off later this afternoon between pro-democracy student activists and high-level Hong Kong officials have been scrapped. The territory's #2 official, Chief Secretary Carrie Lam, herself made that announcement last night, saying calls by student leaders to return to protests had seriously undermined the basis for constructive dialogue. This, as a political bombshell of sorts, has hit the territory's Chief Executive, C.Y. Leung. Hong Kong lawmakers are demanding a thorough investigation after an Australian media outlet reported that the leader had accepted more than $6 million from an Australia company in a suspected bribe. Leung's office has denied any wrongdoing, though the Australian company insisted it was not obliged to reveal the deal. And finally, new cross-border violence between India and Pakistan has claimed at least 17 lives in the worst skirmishes the disputed area of Kashmir has seen in a decade. Artillery, rifle, and mortar fire continued for a 4th day on Thursday as a truce that had mostly held since 2003 increasingly appears to be shaky. Both sides has accused the other of starting the conflict. 20,000 Indian civilians are reported to have fled to refugee camps as fighting riddled the 200-kilometer-long border stretch of the disputed, mostly Muslim region.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on NEWSLINE at Noon with Mark Broome and Eoh Jin-joo.
I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics.
The Korean government has rejected the results of a referendum on the construction of a nuclear power plant in the country's northeastern city of Samcheok, saying it was invalid. 9 out of 10 residents said they didn't want the plant in their city. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
As expected, residents of the city of Samcheok have rejected a referendum on a nuclear power plant in their city. 84.9% of the city's residents were against plant construction and only 14.4% for it. With the participation of over 2/3 of the city's 420,000 eligible voters. The referendum was hosted by the city and anti-nuclear power plant activists seeking to force the central government to retract the plan to build a plant.
Residents of Samcheok, we have won today. I am moved to tears by your support.
The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy says that the results are invalid on grounds the poll was arranged by a civic group and not by the official election management committee. The ministry has made it clear it will push ahead with the plan to build a plant. Pro-nuclear power plant groups have also questioned the poll's reliability.
We can't accept the results of a vote orchestrated to pursue interests of local government employees. It's an invalid exercise, so should be nullified.
The dispute over the plant between the residents and the government has gone on for 4 years, intensifying since the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster in 2011. This isn't the first time the government has tried to build a nuclear power plant in Samcheok. Another plan was scrapped in 1998 due to citizen protests. Although the government has rejected the results of the Samcheok referendum on the basis that it was conducted independently, it accepted the results of another locally arranged referendum held in 2004. That year, a plan to build a radioactive waste disposal facility in Puan, southwest of Seoul, was scrapped after voters rejected it in a similar referendum. Despite international efforts to reduce the number of nuclear power plants, Korea has plans to build 7 additional plants by 2035. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
A new OECD survey shows that 1 out of every 4 boys in Korea between the ages of 5 and 17 are either overweight or obese. This percentage is higher than the OECD average of 23% and stands in sharp contrast to the adult obesity rate, which is the 5th lowest among the 40 countries on the research list. India had the lowest adult obesity rate, followed by Indonesia, China, and Japan. Now, in a separate research, the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says 1 in 10 children in Korea are obese, and the obesity rate is higher for teenage boys. Teenage girls in Korea, meanwhile, were below the OECD average.
Now, in just over 1 week's time, representatives of almost 200 countries will converge on Korea's southern port city of Busan for the 2014 meeting of the International Telecommunication Union. Now, this is an organization with a very long history under the umbrella of the United Nations, so it's a huge deal. And it's the first time Korea is hosting this conference after joining the group more than 50 years ago. Our Song Ji-son reports.
It is the world's oldest international organization, originally established to promote cross-border cooperation in wire telegraphs. It is now high-tech, with an agenda that extends to managing satellite orbits. But advanced technology is no longer the only concern for the 193 countries that participate in the ITU plenipotentiary. Narrowing the information gap between nations is one task, as is sharing ICT policy experience and directions that a common vision for the future by discussing issues like cybersecurity and child online protection. A day before the official kickoff of the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, the annual ICT ministerial meeting, hosted by Korea for a decade now, will be held at Busan's APEC House under the theme the future role of ICT and sustainable development with inclusive ICTs.
Korea hopes to boast its reputation as an ICT powerhouse at this event. It will be a completely paperless conference where all participants will receive updated information on their tablet PCs and smartphones throughout the sessions. We've also set up giga-scale landlines and mobile connections for that.
After hosting the event, the Korean government hopes the impression left on participants helps domestic ICT corporations expand their export channels. The Ministry of Science, ICT and Future Planning also seeks to use this opportunity to promote Seoul's creative economy models by encouraging small and mid-sized companies to exhibit their ideas and products at multiple expos held throughout the 3-week conference. 송지선, Arirang News.
Now in tech news, from cars that can change their shapes to vehicles that can be attached and detached from one another. These are just some of the future-looking vehicles that were unveiled during Hyundai Motors' Idea Festival. Our Kim Min-ji takes a look.
This vehicle can rotate 360 degrees, move in zigzag patterns, and easily fit into small parking spaces. When driving down narrow roads, it can even make itself smaller.
I developed this car to make driving fun, easier, and more convenient for inexperienced drivers like my wife.
Although this car looks like an average SUV, the internal layout is what makes it special. The doors can be lifted so it's able to turn into a camping tent structure, and the seats are detachable and can transform to become their own modes of transportation. Dubbed Space Former, this car was awarded first place for its unique idea and its potential for mass production.
I wanted to make a car which users no longer think of as a mere mode of transportation, but a part of their life space.
Depending on their purpose, these vehicles can be transformed into SUVs or trucks, change the structural layout of tires, or can even be attached to one another.
Although the ideas are small, there are so many that can be fused with vehicles. We saw great potential for the future.
Another form of vehicle that caught the attention of spectators were single modes of transportation, including ones that combine with automatic wheelchairs and crutches. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, in recent years, technology has completely transformed the way we listen to music. Long gone are the days when you had to wait for your favourite artist's CD to come out, because practically every piece of music ever released in history can be ours at the click of a mouse button or our smartphones. This is great, of course, for music lovers, but for the artists themselves, it has its pros and cons. Our Shin Se-min reports.
Downloading and streaming services have given music lovers unlimited access to their favorite albums, but for the artists themselves, the technology is a double-edged sword. 4-time Grammy Award-winning record engineer Jimmy Douglas says the shift has made it much more difficult for musicians and record companies to generate profits.
Even though we seem to have entered a new age where the record companies don't quite have the same hold, now the money's gotten away, and now the streaming people have hold of the money. So what happens, the little guy gets totally pushed out of the way, and the big guy is now making more money, which is great for them, but it's just inequitable.
And while the effects of the fast-changing nature of technology has had negative effects, musicians have also used it to their advantage for free publicity.
And sometimes it even leads to contracts with actual record labels. Such was the case with Eastern Sidekick, a Korean indie rock band.
At first, we started out small, but after a couple of gigs at clubs in Hongdae and putting some of our performances online, the size of the crowds grew and grew, and this is where we are now.
Count business manager Eric Sussman among those who have benefited from the changing times. Through a Kickstarter campaign along with the now famous Amanda Palmer, the duo raised more than $1 million in just 18 months. Sussman said similar campaigns could be a good fit for Korean musicians.
Especially with how wired Korea is, it seems to me that getting the message out ought to be very easy. And the more people you reach, the higher your chances of finding the people that will support you. And in that sense, I think the market here is ripe for this kind of action.
Insiders say newcomers will have to take full advantage of the technology already established in Korea to make themselves heard by the masses. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Our chilly morning is becoming a warm afternoon under plenty of sunshine, with highs peaking in the mid to upper 20s in many regions. So the big temperature difference continues today, so dress accordingly to avoid catching a cold. With that in mind, here are the readings for today. Now, the daytime high in the capital will rise to 27, while Busan peak at 25 this afternoon. And for other regions, Jeju Island should see highs of 23, while Mount Kumgang peaks at 12. Now, it seems like the delightful autumn weather should continue through the weekend, with highs remaining on the warm side under lots of sunshine. That's all for now, and back to you guys in the studio.
Well, thank you, Jim, for the weather update, and that does it for this Friday edition of Newsline at Noon.
Jin-joo and I will be back at the same time on Monday. Have a fabulous weekend.